In this video, I'm going to take a look at Kiss of the Vampire as a text, and in particular the way in which gender representations are constructed. In order to do that, it's important to consider the context in which this film was produced and first received. 1963, we have an audience which are familiar with the tropes of the horror genre within the period. It is still a patriarchal society, but there is a growing sense of female liberation and female position within society, and in particular a developing female sexual liberation as a result of the contraceptive pill and other issues. And we certainly see that sense of growing feminine strength represented in the poster itself. As a result of that, we could argue that we get a subversion of gender expectations in the representations on the poster. We certainly have an equality through the male and female antagonist. Both of them have power within the product through their villainy. We also seem to have an equality in terms of the victims, because we have a female and a male victim. It could be argued that even within the male antagonist there is a sense of vulnerability. His arm across his chest and the panicked expression on his face might be seen as fearful and defensive in some way. Certainly there is a clear sense that the female is in a position of strength and dominance. First of all, she is exerting her power over the male victim, and importantly, she is foregrounded. Now, we can either argue she's foregrounded to exert her dominance within the poster, or we could say she's foregrounded to be made an example of, but we'll come on to that idea a little bit later. But it's important to remember that this is a male-dominated industry at the time, and that this is a male-dominated production. We can clearly see that in the credits on the poster. The male stars are prioritised, clearly paid more, but also prioritised over the female stars, even though there seems to be a sense of equality in the poster. And we could even argue that the female is foregrounded. It is the male stars who dominate the credits. And we can also see it's a screenplay by a man, it is directed by a man, it is produced by a man. So we have to consider whether or not females are given a position of dominance and authority within this poster. And the reason why we need to consider that is because that 60s horror carries many of the conventions of the Gothic genre, and it's very, very clear to see those in the Kiss of the Vampire poster. We have a tyrannical male figure, we have female victims, we have a sexually deviant woman in some respects, isolated locations and bats, part of the iconography of the Gothic. We have a clear battle between good and evil. But the Gothic came about as a manifestation of male fears and paranoia in the 19th century, and particularly male fears about growing female dominance, and in particular growing female sexual power and liberation. So it's clear to see the link between the 1960s and the rise of Gothic in the 19th century, because in the 1960s we also have a movement of female liberation, female sexual liberation, that in many ways threatens the patriarchal order. And so the women in this poster, particularly the female antagonist, might be seen as a manifestation of male fears and paranoias about the threat to their dominance. And often in the Gothic, any female with power within the Gothic genre becomes sexually deviant in some way and needs to be made an example of. And so we might see these representations as a reinforcement of gender expectation rather than a subversion. Certainly, the male antagonist, through his red costume, is connected explicitly to the dripping blood from the dagger-like V of a vampire in the typography. And in doing so, through making that connection, the male is in some way empowered. He becomes the character of threat. He becomes the character that can kill and cause harm. We have in the male antagonist and the female victim a clear representation of male strength and female weakness. The woman is in a position of absolute and complete subservience, and the man is holding her with one hand. There's a clear demonstration of masculine strength. We have the classic female displays of flesh, and the women are therefore reduced in some way by that sexualized representation of them. The female strength is in some way deviant and unusual. She is connected to the supernatural. We can see the bat biting her, so she becomes at one with the supernatural, and as such she becomes othered, she becomes something else. If she holds power as in a human form, then the audience has to accept the possibility of female power. But if the audience can reject her as in some way supernatural or other, then they can reject the dominance that she seems to represent. And we have to draw a distinction, I think, between the male and the female victim. Whilst the female victim is sexualized and positioned in a place of absolute weakness, the position of the man makes his sacrifice in some way honourable, as if he's giving himself up in some ways. And if we look closely, we can even see the vein within his arm, which in some ways makes him more masculine than the purity of the female victim. So let's consider some theory here. Well, Van Zoonen is an obvious, and I think perhaps the best theorist to apply. If we're looking at representations, we should start with representation theorists. Now, Van Zoonen's first idea is the idea that gender is constructed through discourse and that its meaning varies according to cultural and historical context. If that's the case, then the fact that this was produced in 1963 becomes significant. If the 1960s are a period of female liberation and growing female power, then it's easy to read the audience, particularly a female audience, can read the female antagonist as an aspirational figure in some way, a figure who asserts her dominance over the male form, and particularly who asserts her dominance as a sexualized female. There's an idea of sexual strength and dominance there. The next idea is the idea that the display of women's bodies as objects to be looked at is a core element of Western patriarchal culture, and that is clear to see in this film poster. Even when the women are promoted into a position of power through the female antagonist, she is sexualized in a way that the male antagonist and male victim are not. Even as a victim, the male is not sexualized. If we look, he may have the open shirt, but his skin tone is much, much darker, and he's covered in blood and dirt, whereas the female victim, the focus is very much on her flesh, her chest, her arms, her face, and her legs. So the female victim is reduced through sexualization in a way that the man is not. And even in a position of power, the woman is sexualized. The attention is on the whiteness of her face, her chest, her arms. And that links us on to the third idea, the idea that in mainstream culture, the visual and narrative codes that are used to construct the male body as spectacle differ from those used to objectify the female. We can see that very, very clearly here. The male antagonist is entirely covered. The male victim is reduced in terms of the way we look at him, but it is not done so in a sexualized way. Stuart Hall is also a useful theorist here. The idea that stereotyping as a form of representation reduces people to a few simple characteristics or traits. Well, on the one hand, we might be able to say that Kiss of the Vampire challenges that strand of Hall's theory, because we've already looked at the way that in some ways the female representations are empowering, particularly the female antagonist. And we've looked at ways in which the male characters are reduced in some way. So we could say these are progressive stereotypes of femininity and masculinity. But on the other hand, it's important to look at the way women are reduced through sexual and subservient stereotypes. The female victim is utterly subservient. The female antagonist in a position of power is sexualized. So in some ways, both of them are reduced to the narrow stereotypes of femininity that we've seen in film throughout the decades. And that makes sense if we look at Hall's other idea, that stereotyping tends to occur where there are inequalities of power, as subordinate or excluded groups are constructed as different or other. And we clearly see evidence of that in the Kiss of the Vampire poster. It's a male-dominated film in a male-dominated industry, and both of the females, but particularly the female antagonist, is constructed as other. She becomes a sexual predator in some ways, and she is certainly linked more closely to the supernatural through her light skin tone and through her connection to the bat than the male antagonist is. So she is othered through her link to the supernatural, and through that link she is reduced in some way. She holds less power through that link than she would if she was displayed in more human terms. And then, although Levi-Strauss is not a representation theorist, I think he's important here in order to determine how representations are constructed through binary oppositions. Identifying binary oppositions is easy. Levi-Strauss only becomes interesting if we consider the way in which those binaries are structured, because it is the structure of the binaries and the outcome of those binaries which has ideological significance. In the binary of men and women, and there is a clear binary of men and women established in this film poster, we could argue that the female antagonist is foregrounded and therefore she is given greater power or threat. So that binary is structured in a way to promote female dominance. Or you could argue that she is foregrounded in order to make an example of her dominance, and therefore she becomes a figure where female strength is reduced. There are two men and one woman in a position of weakness if we consider the male vampire's arm across his chest and the male victim, and only one woman in a position of weakness. And so again, in that binary between men and women, we might argue that it is women who are empowered, and therefore the ideological significance of that is that we see a progressive representation of women. Evil is certainly privileged over good in this film poster. There's no question about that. But evil is privileged over good through the female antagonist. Now, it's important for you to think about, and it can be read both ways, is this a progressive or a regressive representation? Either we can say she becomes dominant through her evil, or we can say that we can dismiss her significance through her connection to the supernatural. I hope that's been useful. I think it's important now for you to go away and look at the Kiss of the Vampire on your own and think about some of these ideas when you're annotating it and writing your essays.